ponytails and smiles. Pervasive language keeps sexism in Olympic sport at play. To see that some commentators still hadn't done the absolute minimum of learning an Olympic athlete's name basically reinforces that stereotype that no one is watching, no one cares about women's football, or female athletes, Smith said. Roll their eyes. Academics studying the intersection of gender and sport highlight the fact that commentators continue to use the word girls to describe elite female athletes, regardless of their age, while they would rarely refer to male athletes as boys. I mean, if you just flipped it, and you thought about a commentator talking about boy, it's comical. Think added that she believes that sort of language has an impact on how people perceive female athletes, but that it is unclear how that language impacts how female athletes view themselves. She said, "I think they probably roll their eyes a lot of times at some of those commentators." Still, visibility and interest for women's sport continues to grow, with former and current athletes often playing a significant role lifting those profiles, according to Smith. A 2018 Nielsen sports study found that the volume of media coverage of women's sports across Europe ranged from as low as 2% to just 12% at peak times, whereas the Olympics represent a more balanced playing field in terms of competition. Plus, the Olympics tends to fare better in terms of balanced coverage for women's sport than in the normal sports landscape. The record number of female athletes participating in the Tokyo 2020 Olympics might signal yet another indicator of that progression. But gender inequality still very much exists at the Games, with the infantilization and sexualization of female athletes a pervasive force. Smith points to another Olympic football match last week, where a Team GB athlete's swishing blonde ponytail was the subject of commentary, or how one male commentator pontificated about the beautiful smile of a Rugby Sevens player. Ahead of 2020 Games, the International Olympic Committee released new guidelines for the media to counter such coverage, encouraging broadcasters to put gender equality at the forefront of coverage, to avoid sexualizing women and to treat all athletes with integrity, instead of focusing unnecessarily on looks, clothing or intimate body parts.
But even the IOC's new gender equality advisor, the former Olympic swimmer Naoko Imada, has said host country Japan was failing in that regard. Last week she blasted her home country's coverage, saying that Japanese broadcasters continue to use the word girls' wives or mothers when describing the athletes, instead of focusing on them as pure athletes. Fastest vs. Pregnant. It is language that researchers at Cambridge University have identified as consistent with general sports reporting. In a 2016 study, researchers found that men are mentioned almost 3 times more often than women in general sport reporting, with language around female athletes focusing disproportionately on aesthetics and personal lives. Meanwhile, female athletes were associated with the words aged, pregnant, married, compete, participate, and strive. The researchers drew from the same data to analyze how those word associations would play out at the Rio 2016 Olympics. While they found that some language had improved, with the use of the gender-neutral term sportsperson used with higher frequency in comparison to the language of sports in general, men's sports still received 20% more airtime at the Olympics. Culture plays a part. Underpinning that language is New Zealand's structural commitment to gender parity. The country sits in 4th place for gender equality, according to the 2021 World Economic Forum Index. There is sort of a kind of energy in New Zealand at the moment around gender equality and making sure that we do the best job and don't fall into these old tropes in terms of how you talk about female athletes, Bruce said. When there is a real commitment towards gender equality and growing women's sport, coupled with growing the diversity of people who are commenting, writing or in charge of news coverage, significant progress can be made, Bruce said. Still, she acknowledged that New Zealand is likely to be in a different place as a nation compared to some of the other countries. This rings true for Smith, who played 74 times for New Zealand and whose 10-year international football career brought her to clubs in the US, Germany, Sweden and Switzerland.
In Germany, the media continued to perpetuate narrow and damaging stereotypes of female footballers, she said, even when their team thrice held the title of European champions. But in places like the US, or in Sweden, language around women in sport appeared to be much more concentrated on terms like athleticism and strength, she said. I think that really set them behind both in like the performance and the athletes, Smith said, but also in commentary and how they look at athletes and how they look at women. She added that those practices still prevailed, pointing to the fact that schoolgirls are still unable to play or access the same opportunities to play football as boys, with many encouraged to take up netball instead. Basketball, golf, football, and cycling is often just called by their names, while female teams will be marked as women's basketball, women's golf, women's football. Kyung-Yem Kim, assistant professor of the practice of social science at Boston College, explains that ultimately these problems stem from a sex-segregated structure that is based on the sexist understanding of gender differences. It is this understanding of gender that causes this problematic media coverage of girls of women, Kim said, adding that the infantilizing and ambivalent framing of women's accomplishment in sports stems from our social understanding of gender. In order to change this language, that entire system has to be challenged, she said. This year, Tokyo 2020 is hosting 18 mixed-gender events. The IOC and their entire structure of sport basically reproduces and embodies the binarized and hierarchical forms of gender, said Kim. If they want to challenge this sexist language and hierarchical language, then there should be discussions, at least, to talk about how the IOC can be a frontline institution thinking critically about this binary notion about sports structure as a whole. Recognizing that there is a perceived tension between fairness/safety and inclusion/non-discrimination, and in consideration of the latest developments on many fronts, the IOC has decided in October 2019 to work on a new comprehensive and rights-respecting approach to address the complexity of this issue.
There has been much debate about the inclusion of transgender athletes in the Games, with the IOC saying that they will review guidelines for trans athletes after Tokyo 2020. I am not entirely unaware of the controversy which surrounds my participation at these Games, said New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard, who became the first out transgender woman to compete in the 125-year history of the Olympics on Monday. And as such, I would particularly like to thank the IOC for, I think, really affirming its commitment to the principles of Olympism and establishing that sport is something for all people. It is inclusive, accessible. For Smith, who now works as a consultant, there are clear steps that we can take to drive this change, including elevating former athletes who can speak from a position of experience and authority to commentator roles, as well as investing in more women at the executive level. Without that commitment, the cycle will continue, with the next generation not living up to their full potential, she said.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe